These 7 hours of silence were some of the hardest 7 hours I've ever had. So if you watched our previous COVID video, you'll have a little bit more context, but if you've missed it, we have essentially been on a week-long journey of having COVID, and this is part 2. Week 2 of having COVID was, I won't say as bad as week 1, but we didn't know what was coming. Week 2 was much worse and unfortunately much more chaotic. I started with major gastrointestinal problems and, to our dismay, unfortunately, really bad Crohn's flare-up thanks to COVID. All of my COVID went internal. Thankfully, wasn't throwing up or anything really bad, but had really bad nausea, zero appetite, and unfortunately, my large intestine and probably my small intestines were just simply not working. This is not an unheard of complication of COVID with someone with chronic illness. However, it is a bad complication of COVID. So I spent the next 4 days trying to pump the liquids to the max and ensuring I stayed hydrated and had some type of nutrition in my body. I wasn't eating much of anything. Luke and I sat down to watch Thursday night football, and I felt a little bit worse than normal, but quite honestly, I hadn't eaten in going on 10 days. I just honestly just thought it was COVID more than anything. Luke was pretty much back to normal at this point. He had been back at work for a few days, and then all hell broke loose. I went into a seizure. Didn't know at the time, but I wouldn't come to for 30 minutes. For those of you who may not be familiar with seizures or people with seizure disorders, I don't have epileptic seizures, but I have absent seizures, which means I don't necessarily flail around, but I just essentially doze off, and it looks like I have passed out. They are seizures. They are not fainting episodes, what we used to call them, because we didn't know what they were. They should not last more than 5 to 7 minutes, 10 at the most for some people who have longer seizures. But when you have a 30-minute seizure, it's an emergency situation. Unfortunately, things got much worse when I came to and was unable to speak, and this is when we called the ambulance. I wasn't able to move, talk, or walk, and this is where unfortunately I had to convince my lovely husband to call the ambulance because he hates calling the ambulance, hates dealing with paramedics. And well, he is fair in saying that, and we'll get to that in a minute. Calling an ambulance service is quite easy. 911. In real life, it means having to put our cats away. Our house is set up for all of these things, and we are very thankful to have our house completely accessible for them. They were here not too long ago in May. You can watch that video after this one. Fire paramedic crew actually remembered who I was, which, you know, is not the ideal situation, but they reassured the paramedics that my situation was quite critical and were very adamant that I should go into hospital. There was some confusion as to whether or not I had had a seizure or if it was just a fainting spell or things like that. The paramedics and Luke had quite the debate over certain things, and I just had to sit there and coherently have to listen to these debates because unfortunately I was not able to speak. It was one of the hardest things to do throughout this process. 7 hours of losing the ability to speak and have zero function of your body. Whew, I'm used to losing function of my body because that happens pretty much every time I have a seizure, but losing the ability to speak and not being able to communicate and advocate for myself as a patient, I've spoken to you guys multiple times about advocacy, but I have never had to have someone else advocate on my behalf. And this is something Luke and I spoke about once I was able to speak again. and this is something we're gonna have to work on in the future, is actually have him understand how to advocate for me. If I'm not able to advocate for myself, there are little things when it comes to advocacy that are critically important, and I didn't realize at what point I had learned how to advocate for myself until I saw a beginner have to advocate for myself again, because I've been in this process for 7 years. It taught me a lot that night. Hope to never have to go through that again, but I'm also completely aware that there's a chance, and quite frankly, probably a good chance, that this may happen again, and we have to be prepared for that. And so Luke and I have been working on a one sheet of all my disorders, meds, all of those things, which we had been working on prior to this, that we had kind of put aside because quite frankly, I'd been doing a little bit better and we shouldn't have done that. It's been sitting on my computer for far too long and we need to finish it. And it's something that's really high on our priority list, you know, just waiting for me to feel a bit better to finalize it. And it's something that's gonna get done ASAP, because Luke needs to be able to have a one sheet document that he can hand the paramedics, and for them to have the entire context of what was happening with me and just have an update of all of those things. And so if you don't have a one sheet, for the people who are around you, especially in medical emergencies, please, please, please have one. We're going to be doing an entire dedicated video to that. So stay tuned and subscribe if you aren't already, if you're interested in that video. It's going to be a dandy one. But back to the emergency story. So when we finally got into the ambulance, Luke couldn't come with me in the ambulance. Obviously, he had to drive to the hospital via car because we needed a vehicle to get home when I would eventually get discharged. And so I was by myself, couldn't speak. This is one thing. I wish paramedics had a way of better communicating with me, a chart for yes, no, or something, because oh my goodness, the paramedic kept asking me questions that were not yes, no. And all I had was my ability to either squeeze her hand at this point or blink my eyes. And that's all I had. And she kept asking me super complicated questions that I could not answer and was just frustrating me to all good gosh. Oh my goodness, I was getting hecka frustrated. And then halfway through our drive to the hospital, she finally got to the point where she finally started asking me yes, no questions. And I think she finally started getting some actual information that was useful. But she kept asking me why we had a ramp, and that just drove me absolutely nuts. Does it matter why we have a ramp? Like, I could have family members that need to use it, and that's why we built it. It could be because I need it, and obviously it's built because of me. And Luke explained that to her because I was in the room when he did explain that to her. I'm not able to communicate with you. I can't communicate 7 years of medical history as to why we have a ramp. Doing stairs is very hard for me. We decided to put a ramp in so that I didn't have to do stairs walking into the house every day. It just made logical sense. We had medical coverage that supported that. My doctor thought it was a good idea, so we did it. How am I supposed to do that? Nodding yes, no. But that's not why we're here. That's not what this conversation's about. You're trying to get medical information to try and understand what is going on with me right now. I can't speak. I had a 30-minute seizure, and that's what my husband's told you. And we're trying to figure out whether or not something more sinister is happening right now. And you are just hammering about this gosh darn ramp. Oh, that's where we were. My paramedics were driving me a little bit insane, but we were getting close to the hospital. Unfortunately though, our medical system is a little bit overrun at the moment. COVID infections are skyrocketing. They're up, I won't say a percentage because I don't know what it is, but it's insane. And paramedics are on top of each other. Gurneys are flying everywhere. And they finally find a corner for me to go to, and I overhear the paramedics doing their charge-in to the nurse at St. B Hospital. These lovely paramedics, we later found out, were at the end of their shift, so I can imagine they're exhausted. They've been dealing with egregious wait times between dropping off patients. They've had a rough night. The paramedic told the charge nurse that I had a fainting episode and it lasted a while and now I couldn't speak. I had COVID and that was about it. The patient advocacy wasn't really there. My entire story wasn't exactly explained, and that was pretty much it. Luke eventually did find me in emerge triage. Because I wasn't able to walk and couldn't move, I had to stay on a bed, and so the paramedics were even more frustrated because they had to stay with me much longer than they probably would have wanted to, but they couldn't move me off their triage and into a bed because there were no longer any beds available. Quite frankly, a bit of a mess at this point. Eventually, I would then get put onto a bed as patients made the decision after many, many hours of waiting, decided that they were okay to go home, go into an emerge after multiple hours of waiting, decide to discharge yourself. That is the biggest thing that drives me absolutely up the wall when it comes to emergencies, because I understand in a panic, you'll make a decision to go into an emerge seeking care. At a minimum, you should at least wait to see a doctor, make sure your blood work's okay, and then leave. I do understand that people get frustrated with wait times and just say, screw it, I'm just gonna go. But in that moment, you had a reason for wanting to go into emerge, and you should trust your gut as a patient. And that's all I'm gonna say about that. But we ended up with a bed because someone decided to leave. I still wasn't able to talk at this point. Luke was exhausted. It's like 4 a.m. 7.5 hours passed by, and all of a sudden I, in 15-20 minute intervals, would try and speak because this was frustrating as heck. And nothing would come out. And all of a sudden, I try and speak and randomly say a word. I don't even know what word it was, but it made absolutely no sense. But something came out. And then I said Luke's name, and all of a sudden, I'm like, holy moly, I can talk again. And I just was elated. I was like, oh my God, my brain's working again. I don't know what the heck happened. We just assumed the seizure lasted so long that things weren't working properly. I was quite out of it still, but I was just happy that I could speak again. And then Luke and I kind of debriefed about everything that had happened, the fact that the paramedics were kind of out of it. And then I told him to get one of the charge nurses because I wanted to speak to a nurse and explain my side of it and actually have some patient advocacy about what had actually happened, what my thoughts were, and all of that. That obviously took some time. Everything took forever. Once that was done, we were like, okay, now we just wait. And obviously Luke at this point was like, do we really have to say, can we go? And I'm like, I would love to say yes to this, but this was way too much of an out of normal seizure to just leave. I couldn't make that call. As I just said, we had to wait to see at least a doctor, get my blood work checked, make sure nothing else had happened. Midi strokes and things like that can be common with people with seizures. And at my age, it's not common, but we had to rule it out, make sure that the doctor didn't see fit for a CT or an MRI or something else. And we didn't want to just chalk it up to COVID, but we had to make sure that nothing else was going on, as much as I would have loved to leave. I got my voice back, but unfortunately, 2 hours later, I go straight into another seizure. This is typically called cluster seizuring, where your brain is just trying to get back to normal and it just can't, so it goes into another seizure. And I love my husband to death, but of course he's so used to seeing me have seizures that he just sits there and lets it happen, which is fine in most cases. But when you're in an emergency situation, when you're in emerge, this is where you typically want to go get a triage nurse and let the nurse see the seizure happen, have her check your blood pressure, check your heart rate, and make sure that she actually sees it happening. You're just making note to the nurse that you got into a seizure. You want the nurse to see that, and you want the nurse to be aware of what's going on. I come out of the seizure and kind of tell Luke to go shove it a little bit. I got slightly mad. Sorry, honey. and told him to go get the nurse, her know that I had had a seizure and that things were feeling a little weird. I wasn't feeling very well, and that she needed to be aware of this. Because I had had my blood pressure taken at this point for like 6 hours, and I was wanting to know what my blood pressure was at this point. The nurse knew I had had a seizure. Nothing happened at this point. I now go into a third seizure. Luke at this point was told, if I go into another seizure, go get a nurse. And so he went and got the nurse. The nurse sees the seizure. I go into straight chills. I am sopping wet. And the nurse essentially starts being like, okay, this is not good. I need her to be at a different level. She needs to come out of triage. I was in cluster seizures at this point, and I wasn't coming out of it. What they ended up doing was bringing me into Emerge. That's where things kind of stayed, because we were in the midst of doctors transferring from overnights into days. And that meant waiting. So you typically have to wait 3 or 4 hours for that transfer to happen, for everything to be completely transferred over. Thankfully, the nurses were absolutely fantastic. I will say that we had some of the best nurse care ever, because the last time we were in Emerge, the nurses were questionable. I did have one more seizure. I had 4 seizures that day, but it wasn't as severe as the third one. The third one was bad. Fourth one, for some reason, just didn't last very long and wasn't as intense. And so we kind of just waited. Then the doctors arrive, and quite frankly, nothing much happened. They made the decision that all of my labs were pretty much fine, and the seizures were allocated to COVID and my COVID infection. The start of my medical journey started with a virus, and so when I get viral infections, my body kind of loses it for a while. So I didn't disagree with them on that. I have multiple neuro appointments, and waiting another 10 hours to get just a second opinion with a neurologist. At this point, after waiting 20 some hours to see a doctor, all my blood work was normal with the exception of one level. And I'd never heard of this before, but apparently phosphate is something that you typically ingest in food in small quantities, and since I hadn't eaten in a while, my phosphate levels weren't quite normal. Phosphate can be quite dangerous if low, and can cause seizures, can cause comas, and even death if it isn't in your body at all. They decided to give me this phosphate tablet that they put in water. It dissolves in water. It tastes awful. The only other concern that they really had was the fact that, well, I couldn't remember what day it was or what year it was. I still had quite a lot of confusion. That could be related to COVID, could be related to the length of my seizure, or could be related to the low phosphate, depending on how long the phosphate issue had been going on, and the fact that, quite frankly, I hadn't been eating for 12 days. So it had been quite some time. They gave me this phosphate. I drank it. It was awful, but I'm pretty used to some awful drinks at this point in my life. So the doctors gave me 2 options. Wait 10 hours, see a neurologist, get a second opinion, and see what happens, or go home and rest. Assume it was COVID and move on. Talk to my neurologist when I see him next. Well, Luke and I made the decision to discharge and go home. I still don't know if that was the right call, to be completely honest with you. I had another major seizure in the last few days. I still don't know why. We are due for an incredibly complicated test in the next couple weeks. I've left a few messages with my neurologist, so he is aware of everything that is going on. This test is going to give us a lot of light into what the future and what my seizure situation is looking like. And that's why we're not incredibly concerned about what is going on, because this test is what everybody, all my doctors, all of my specialists are really been waiting for. We've been waiting for this test since March. This next EEG test is going to be incredibly critical to the future of my health. And we're all waiting with big hopes that we're gonna get some answers for the first time in 7 years as to what is truly going on. As my body continues to recover from COVID and these lovely complex seizures, I have regained most of my cognitive function, thankfully. I have not lost my voice since this seizure in November, which is good. I hope you have enjoyed this crazy emergency story and the reality that you should just enjoy every day you've got on this crazy planet. I hope you're enjoying your holiday season so far. Don't forget to slow your roll. We'll see you in the next one, but if you missed the first part of this crazy COVID story, check it over here.